The auctioneer's mallet struck the block once. The sound went through the midsummer crowd like a thrown stone going through still water.
To the gentleman in
A
front.
slow ring that everyone in the square felt in the small bones of their feet before they heard it in their ears. It struck a second time. Somewhere behind Bryn Aldane, a child laughed at something that had nothing to do with the platform, and a vendor 2 stalls over called the price of figs, and a draft horse stamped, and the regent in his pale gray coat at the back of the crowd shifted his weight from one polished boot to the other and did not, for the 3rd hour running, look at the man in chains on the platform. He was looking at her. The mallet struck a 3rd time, and on the 3rd strike, Bryn's hand let go of the coin pouch she had been white-knuckling against her ribs for the last hour. The leather was damp where her fingers had been. The pouch was heavier than any village girl's purse had a right to be, heavier than the bride price the Council of Lomere had pressed into her palm at dawn with their eyes refusing to meet hers, heavier than her grandmother's hidden coin, heavier than any honest weight of metal, because one of the coins inside was older than the rest, and struck with a sigil that nobody in this market would have recognized, except the man in the pale gray coat, who had been waiting 26 years to see whose hand finally carried it into open daylight. The mallet had not fallen on the king yet. She had not bid yet. Both of those things were about to happen in the same breath. The man on the platform was on his knees because they had broken something in his right leg to keep him there. His head was down. Iron had been driven through the meat of his shoulders in 2 places to keep the second self under, and the iron had blackened the skin around it, and the skin had wept, and the weeping had crusted, and over the crust someone had thrown a half bucket of seawater for the joke of it. He had not flinched. He had not lifted his head for the auctioneer. He had not lifted his head for any of the 3 noble houses calling prices at him as though he were a stallion. He lifted his head when Bryn let go of the pouch. Nobody else in the square noticed it. The auctioneer was already calling the next number. The 3 noble bidders were already raising again. A woman in a high-collared green riding coat, the kind of woman who had spent her whole life being told she would one day stand where Bryn was standing. The kind of woman whose mother had told her at 6 years old that the silver-throated border girl was a clerical accident the gods would correct in time, laughed at something her cousin said and did not look at Caelan Thorne either. Bryn looked at him. Under the filth on his chest, under the dried blood and the seawater stain and the white salt crust of 3 days in a wagon, a mark was surfacing. It was not surfacing because of the heat or because of the iron. It was surfacing because she was 20 paces away from him, and because the bomb beneath his sternum, the one the world had told her had died on a battlefield she could not have pointed to on a map when she was 4 years old, had just found the other end of itself for the first time in 26 years and had begun, very slowly, to climb back up through his ruined skin to say so. Bryn felt the silver scar at her throat go warm, the way a banked coal goes warm when someone breathes on it. She did not put her hand to it. She had spent her entire life not putting her hand to it. She had spent her entire life pretending the scar at her throat was a birthmark, a burn, a child's clumsiness with the kettle, anything any of the village women would let her say it was for the length of a single conversation before their eyes slid sideways and they remembered, again, what she was. Marked. Marked for a king who had died before he could come for her. Marked, and therefore untouchable by any other man under ancient law, which was the polite Iron Court way of saying nobody would feed a girl who could never be married off. Nobody would shelter a girl who could never be bartered. Nobody would forgive a girl whose throat carried the silver of a debt the gods themselves had defaulted on. The auctioneer raised the mallet for the 4th strike, the one that would close the sale. Bryn opened her mouth. The number she said was not a number anyone in the square had been prepared to hear from a woman in undyed wool. It was every coin her grandmother had hidden in the hollow, under the third floorboard of the cottage Bryn had not been allowed to inherit. It was every coin the Council of Lomere had scraped together over 26 grudging winters to be rid of her. The bride price they had been saving against the dim hope that some widower 3 valleys over would take her sight unseen, and they could finally close the ledger on the silver-throated girl. It was the older coin, the one with the sigil. It was, to the half-copper, the exact sum that had been bid 1 heartbeat earlier by the lord of the third noble house, +1. The auctioneer's mallet stopped at the top of its arc. The auctioneer was a man named Garrick, who had run the Iron Court's midsummer block for 19 years, and who had, in those 19 years, never once let a sale stutter on his account. He looked at Bryn. He looked at the pouch on the platform rail where she had set it down with both hands. He looked at the lord of the third noble house, who was a man called Reinhold, and Reinhold's mouth had gone into the small, flat line of a man who has been outbid by a peasant, and is calculating, in the next half-second, whether the social cost of raising again is greater or lesser than the social cost of letting her have him. Bryn did not look at Reinhold. She looked at Kaelin. Kaelin was looking back at her. The thing under his sternum was now visible to anyone who cared to look, which meant exactly 2 people in the entire square, because the rest were looking at her purse. The mark on his chest was a faint, twinned arc of silver and shadow, and it was the same shape, in miniature, as the scar at her throat. He saw her see it. Something in his face that had been gone for 3 days came back. Not hope. Hope would have been a foolish word for what came back into Kaelin Thorne's face when he understood, in the dragging, slow way a beaten animal understands a kindness, that the woman who had just emptied her last coin onto an Iron Court platform for him was the one the world had told him was dead at 4 years old. What came back into his face was a deeper and more dangerous thing than hope. It was recognition. Leisha, the woman in the green riding coat, stopped laughing. Her cousin tried to keep telling the joke, and her cousin's voice trailed away because Leisha's hand had closed on her cousin's wrist, hard enough to leave 4 crescent marks. Leisha had spent her life preparing to be the woman who walked across a midsummer market and bought a king. She had not spent her life preparing to watch a border girl in undyed wool do it instead. Behind her, the regent in the pale gray coat finally moved. He moved only his chin, the small upward fraction of an inch a man makes when his patience has been rewarded after a very long wait. And the 2 men in dark livery standing 6 paces behind him understood the gesture and shifted their hands inside their coats and began, with great courtesy, to work their way through the crowd toward the platform. Bryn did not see any of this. Bryn was watching Garrick, the auctioneer. Garrick was watching Reinhold. Reinhold did not raise. He looked at Bryn the way a man looks at a stain on a tablecloth he has decided is not worth lifting the cloth for. And he gave Garrick a small, dismissive lift of 2 fingers, and Garrick, who had 19 years of midsummer in his shoulders, and who could feel, with the precision of a man who lived on commission, that the wind had turned strange in his square, brought the mallet down a 4th time, before any of the other houses could change their minds. The 4th strike landed. The sale was Bryn's. The leather pouch sat on the rail, with a damp, dark print of her palm on its side. Garrick reached for the iron key at his belt to unlock the wrist chains, and that was the moment Kaelin Thorne moved. He moved before the chains came off. The leg they had broken to keep him kneeling did not stop him, because something larger than the leg had decided the leg was not, for the next 4 seconds, going to be a matter under discussion. He came up off his knees in a single shuddering surge that drove the iron in his shoulders deeper, and tore something audibly in his thigh. And Garrick, who had 19 years of midsummer in his shoulders, and who had handled 3 rebellious sales in those years, and put each of them down with the small, lead-tipped club he kept under his coat, for some reason did not reach for the club. Garrick stepped back. Garrick stepped back because the man crossing the platform toward the village girl in undyed wool was, for the first time since they had dragged him out of the wagon, looking at someone. And because the look on his face was a thing Garrick wanted to be a long way away from. Kaelin reached Bryn in 3 strides he should not have been able to take. The chains were still on his wrists. The chain between them rang once when he lifted his arms over her head and brought them down behind her, looping her inside the bracket of his own irons so that they were inside the same cage of metal together. And then his head bent, and his mouth found the silver scar at the side of her throat, and he bit. It was not gentle. It was not meant to be. It was meant to be seen. He set his teeth into the skin over the old scar, the scar the world had been telling her for 26 years was a debt the gods had defaulted on, and he held. And the platform went absolutely silent except for the breath of the king, who was still, technically, the property of the woman whose throat he had his mouth on. Bryn's knees did not give. She had not expected them to hold, and they did. Her hands came up, not to push him away, not to hold him in place either, just up, the way hands come up when a person has not been touched with intention by anyone for 26 years and is being touched with the most intentional touch of a human life. One hand found the side of his face. The other found his wrist, the bare skin between the iron and the heel of his hand, and her fingers closed there. The silver at her throat went hot under his teeth. The mark on his chest, the twinned arc, brightened until it was visible through the dirt to every face turned toward the platform, which by now was every face in the square. He let go. He did not lift his head. He kept his mouth at the place he had just bitten, breathing, and Bryn felt the breath against the wet of her own blood at her throat, and she heard him say, low and rough and only to her, the first word he had said in 3 days. Her name. He said her name. She had no idea how he knew it. She had not given it to the auctioneer. She had not given it to anyone in this square. Garrick the auctioneer, who had, in 19 years of midsummer, never seen what he had just seen, and had, in 19 years, learned to recognize the shape of a sail that had stopped being a sail, cleared his throat and said, in the careful voice of a man putting down a torch in a room that had begun to smell of lamp oil, that under the ancient rite of public claiming, made before the close of sale, witnessed by the assembled court of the midsummer market, the parties on the platform were no longer to be regarded as buyer and bought. Reinhold, who had not raised, made a small sound. Leza, who had wanted to be where Bryn was standing, made no sound at all. The regent in the pale gray coat, 20 paces back in the crowd, smiled. He smiled because the claiming had worked, and because the claiming was exactly what he had wanted to happen. And because acclaimed and awakened Bryn Aldain, in 20 minutes, would be worth more on his block than a beaten Alpha King had ever been on Garrick's. The 2 men in dark livery were now 10 paces from the platform and closing. Bryn felt the change before she understood the change. The bite at her throat had stopped bleeding, which was not a thing bites did, not on the count of seconds it had taken. The silver under her skin had gone from warm to a deeper and unfamiliar register. Not painful, not hot, the slow internal lifting feeling a person gets when a draft has been blowing on them for years and has stopped. Kaelin lifted his head. His pupils were blown black across the gold of his eyes, and Bryn understood with a small flat shock that the second self in him had been the one to cross the platform, not the man. and that the man was only now catching up to what the second self had decided. He looked at her like a person looks at water after 3 days in a desert and is too tired to drink. He said her name a second time. Bryn, whose name had been said by people in Lomere for 26 years only in the tone reserved for unwelcome weather, felt the second saying of it land somewhere very low in her chest and stay. She said his back. Kaelin. The chain between his wrists, still looped behind her shoulders, was the only thing holding him upright. His broken leg had given out the moment the bond closed, and he was leaning on the chain and on her, and she could feel through the press of his ribs against hers that he was burning the kind of fever a body burns when it is healing too much, too fast. Garrick was still talking. Garrick was reciting the formal language of avoidance, the ancient phrases the court kept on the books for exactly this kind of stunt and never expected to need. And Bryn caught maybe 1 word in 3 because Kaelin's mouth had moved to her ear, and Kaelin was, very quietly, telling her to run. "Not yet," he said. "In a moment, when Garrick finishes. There are men coming. There's been men coming all morning. You did not see them because you were not meant to. The gray coat in the back, the 2 in livery, the one with the cracked left boot near the fig vendor. Do not look." Bryn did not look. She nodded into the side of his throat, which smelled, under the salt and the blood and the wagon, of something she did not have words for, but which her body had words for, and which the silver at her throat had words for, and which the bond in her chest answered before her mind agreed to it. Garrick finished. Garrick stepped to the side and made the small 2-finger gesture that meant the platform was clear, and Kaelin unhooked the chain from behind Bryn's shoulders with hands that were shaking and lifted it back over her head, and Bryn took the iron key off Garrick's belt without asking. Garrick let her, which was the most generous thing Garrick had done in 19 years. And she opened the lock on Kaelin's right wrist and the lock on his left, and laid the irons on the platform with the pouch. Then she put her arm under his shoulder, the good shoulder, the one without the iron driven through it, and she walked him off the platform. They went down the 3 wooden steps together. They did not run. Running would have been a confession. They walked the way a woman walks when she has paid for a man legally, and the law has shifted under her feet, and she is the only person in the square who knows yet that she is now walking him out as her bonded equal. Meg, who ran the apothecary stall 2 rows over, and who was the only person in Lomere who had ever said Bryn's name without the weather tone, saw them coming and saw, in one quick read of Bryn's face and Kaelin's leg, exactly what was needed. Meg upended a basket of dried mint across the path of the 2 men in dark livery. The men stopped. The men bent. The men cursed. Meg apologized in the loud, carrying voice of a woman who had been apologizing in markets for 30 years. And by the time the 2 men had picked their way through the mint, Bryn and Kaelin were at the back of the cooper's stall and going through the gap in the canvas Meg had cut 3 years earlier for reasons she had never explained. The gray coat in the back of the crowd watched them go. The gray coat did not pursue. The gray coat lifted a single gloved finger, and a third man, not the 2 in livery, a different man, a man in a brown traveler's cloak Bryn had walked past 4 times that morning without seeing, peeled away from a barrel he had been leaning on and began, at a careful, unhurried pace, to follow them out of the square. Meg's apothecary back room smelled of mint and tallow and the iron tang of the river the building sat on, and Meg, having shut the door and barred it and pulled the shutter and lit a single tallow candle, looked at Bryn and Kaelin on the cot in the corner and said only, "Working. The iron first." Bryn nodded. Kaelin, who had stopped speaking 3 streets ago and had been conserving every breath for the work of staying upright, lay back on the cot and let Meg cut his shirt off him with the small curved knife Meg used for tough roots. The iron in his shoulders came out with a sound Bryn was going to hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. And the wounds did not close, because they were iron wounds. And iron wounds did not close until the iron was gone and the body remembered how. Meg poured something brown over the holes and Kaelin's breath hissed once through his teeth, and then steadied. Carrie, Meg's apprentice, a girl of 17 with a face like a careful clerk, came in with a bowl of clean water and another bowl of something darker and set both down without speaking and went out again to keep watch at the front of the shop. Bryn watched Meg's hands. Meg's hands were sure. Bryn's hands, when she lifted them off Kaelin's wrist to take the cloth Meg passed her, were not. She washed the dried blood off the place at his throat where Garrick's men had put a collar on him in the wagon. She washed his face. She washed the salt off his chest, around the twinned arc that was now, under her hand, the steady banked warm of a thing fully woken and only resting. Kaelin opened his eyes when she touched the mark. He watched her hand on him. He did not speak. He did not need to. The bond was doing the talking for him, in a register Bryn had never been taught to listen to, and was, with the rapid intuition of a person who had spent 26 years reading rooms that did not want to be read, learning in real time. He was telling her, without words, that he had known she was alive for the last hour and 20 minutes, that when the wagon had come into the square at dawn, he had smelled her from 3 streets away and had not believed his own nose, that he had assumed the bond had finally driven him into the soft place beaten men go when they cannot bear another sunrise, that when the mallet had struck the 3rd time and a hand had set down a pouch on the platform rail, he had lifted his head and seen the silver at her throat and understood, with the same flat certainty she had understood him, that the world had been lying to both of them for 26 years. Bryn put her forehead against his. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of another person since she was 11 years old, and was not going to start now. She breathed. He breathed. The candle guttered. Meg, finishing the splint on the leg, said in the dry voice of a woman who had not been thanked yet today, that whatever the two of them were doing with their foreheads was very nice, and that the man in the brown cloak was now at the side door of the apothecary, and that Carrie had gone out the front to ask him politely whether he was lost, and that Carrie would be back inside in approximately 90 seconds, and would have managed in those 90 seconds to learn his hire price and his employer's house colors and the address of his mother. Bryn lifted her head off Kaelin's. Kaelin, watching her, said the first full sentence he had said since the platform, which was that the regent's name was Aldrich Vey, and that Aldrich Vey was the man who had sold Kaelin's pack to the Iron Court 6 years ago for the use of a particular trade route, and that Aldrich Vey had been in the back of the crowd this morning, in a pale gray coat, watching not Kaelin, but Bryn, and that Aldrich Vey had not been watching Bryn because of the silver at her throat. He had been watching her because of the older coin in her pouch, the one with the sigil. Bryn went still. She had inherited the coin from her grandmother. Her grandmother had inherited it from a woman who had walked into Lomere out of a snowstorm in the year Bryn's mother was born, and had refused, to her dying day, to say where she had walked out of. The coin had been the only thing the woman had brought with her. Kaelin, watching Bryn's face, said quietly that the sigil was the seal of the line the original bond had been written to contain, not to honor. That the king Bryn had been marked for at 4 years old had not been marked to her as a courtship. He had been marked to her as a lock, and that he, Kaelin Thorne, having just broken the lock open on an Iron Court platform in front of 300 witnesses, had let out whatever it was the lock had been keeping in. Carrie came back through the front of the shop precisely when Meg had said she would. Carrie reported, in the level voice of a girl who had grown up in a market and knew the worth of facts, that the man in the brown cloak was hired through a fence, 2 streets over, for a flat fee that suggested he was the first of several, that his employer's house colors were not on him, but that he carried a folded sigil card in the inner pocket of his cloak, which she had not been able to see, but which she had been able to feel through the cloth when she had pretended to bump into him, and that the shape of the card was the shape of a card carrying the Vey crest. Meg said, "Ah." Meg said, "Then we have until the next bell." Meg did not say what would happen at the next bell, because Meg was a woman who did not waste breath on the obvious. Bryn looked at Kaelin. Kaelin was already trying to sit up. The splint on his leg held. The iron wounds on his shoulders had begun, slowly, the dark sealing process Bryn had seen on a half-shifted village hunter once, when she was 9. He was healing. He was not healed. He would not be healed in time. He looked at her and read whatever was on her face and said, low, that he could move, that he had moved on worse, that he had a place 3 days' walk north where what remained of his pack was waiting for him to come home or to be confirmed dead, and that if she could get him to the river, he could get them both to the place. Bryn shook her head. 3 days, she said. He would not survive 3 days walking on that leg. He would survive, she said, perhaps 12 hours, and Aldrich Vey would not need 12. Kaelin's jaw set. The second self in him, which had been quiet under Meg's hands, was not interested in 12 hours of survival. The second self was interested in Bryn being out of this town before the next bell, and Bryn could feel its interest, like a hand on the back of her neck. She put her own hand on the back of his neck. She held it there. She said, the river, then. Not 3 days north. The temple ruins. She did not have to explain which ruins. Every person in Lomere knew the ruins. The half-fallen ring of standing stones an hour's walk upriver. The place children dared each other to spend a night in and never did. The place where on 3 different occasions in Bryn's life, she had walked alone when the village had been particularly cruel, and had sat in the moss at the foot of the tallest stone, and had felt, without ever knowing what it was she was feeling, the silver at her throat go warm in a way it had not gone warm anywhere else. Kaelin's eyes changed. He had heard of the ruins. He had heard of them from a different direction than Bryn had. From his father's keeper of laws, from the line of accountings the Thornpack had kept of every sacred site in 3 kingdoms. And what he had heard about them was that they were one of the few places in the world where a bond could be sealed under the eyes of the older powers, rather than under the eyes of a court, and that a bond sealed there was, by ancient compact, beyond the reach of any human court's ownership clause, regardless of how clever the language. He nodded once. Meg, who had been listening without appearing to, said that she would put a story about in the next 10 minutes that Bryn had been seen on the South Road with a man in chains, and that the village miller's cart had not been where it was meant to be at noon. She said the South Road story would buy them perhaps an hour. She said the hour would have to be enough. Bryn put her hand on Meg's wrist. She did not say thank you. Meg did not want thank you. Meg said, when this is done, you owe me a winter's worth of willow bark and an explanation, and not in that order. Carrie appeared at the side door with a bundle. The bundle was a clean shirt and a hooded cloak that had once belonged to Meg's brother, and a pair of boots that were close to Kaelin's size, and a small skin of water, and a wrapped half-loaf and a knife. Bryn helped Kaelin into the shirt. The shirt covered the mark on his chest. The hood covered his face. The boots were a half size too small, and he did not say so. Bryn pulled her own shawl up over her hair, which everyone in Lomere knew by sight, and over the silver at her throat, which everyone in Lomere also knew by sight. Meg blew out the candle. Carrie unbarred the back door. The river was 8 paces past the door. The miller's flat-bottomed boat, which had not been where it was meant to be at noon, and which was now, in fact, tied at Meg's back step under a tarp of riverweed, rocked once on its rope. Bryn helped Kaylin into it. He sat with his bad legs straight along the bottom of the boat, and his good hand on the gunwale, and Bryn took the pole. She had poled the boat exactly 4 times in her life. The pole found the bottom of the river on the 3rd try. The boat moved. The river above Low Mere ran narrow and fast for a 1/4 mile and then opened into the slow green stretch under the willow bend. And in the slow green stretch, Bryn could rest her arms and let the current do the work. Kaylin lay in the bottom of the boat with his head against the coil of rope and his eyes closed and his hand on her ankle, the small grounding touch of a man who needed to know, with the part of him under the skin, that she was still within arm's reach. Bryn watched the bank. The bank was empty for the first half hour because Meg's South Road story had landed and because Aldrich Vey was, somewhere in town, having his men kick in the door of the miller's wife's cousin's house and finding nothing. The bank was not empty after the first half hour. Bryn saw the man in the brown cloak first, 200 paces back along the towpath, walking at the careful, unhurried pace of a man who knew the river bent and who was content to meet them at the bend rather than chase them along the straight. Then she saw a second man, ahead of them, on the far bank, sitting on a fallen log with a fishing line in the water that did not have a hook on the end of it. Then she saw the third, which was not a man, which was a horse and rider on the high ridge above the river, and the rider was not in livery, and was not in a brown cloak, and was, even at that distance, recognizable by the pale gray of his coat. Bryn pulled them around the next bend without slowing. She did not tell Kaylin what she had seen. Kaylin, with his hand on her ankle and the bond between them open in a way it had not been open an hour ago, knew anyway. He opened his eyes. He said her name. He said, "The stones are how far?" She said, 20 minutes by water. He said, "They will be on us in 10. He was right. The first arrow came across the boat from the far bank at the next bend and went into the gunwale 4 fingers from Bryn's hand. The second arrow, from the same direction, would have gone into Bryn's shoulder if Kaylin had not, with the broken leg and the iron-pierced shoulders and the body that should not has been able to do it, come up off the bottom of the boat in a single twisting motion and taken the arrow himself in the meat of his back below the right shoulder blade. He went down on top of her. Bryn caught him with her body and the pole both. The pole skidded out of her hand and into the river. The boat drifted. Kaylin, with the arrow standing out of his back, said only, "Keep going." There were no more arrows. There were no more arrows because the men on the banks did not want her dead. The men on the banks wanted her alive, and bonded, and exhausted, and out of the boat. Bryn understood this in the second of silence after Kaylin's words, the second in which she also understood that the pole was gone, and the current was slow, and the boat was going to drift, at this speed, exactly into the shallow gravel beach at the foot of the temple path, which was where the men on the banks had been driving them all along. She did not panic. She found, somewhere in herself, the same flat, clear place she had stood in on the platform when the Mallet had risen for the 4th time. She put both her hands on the arrow shaft sticking out of Kaylin's back. He shook his head against her shoulder. She broke the shaft off 2 inches above the wound and left the head in, because she had watched Meg do exactly that once with a hunter, and Meg had said the head did less harm in than coming out wrong. And she eased Kaylin down onto his side along the bottom of the boat, with his head in her lap. The boat drifted onto the gravel exactly where she had known it would. The man in the brown cloak was waiting on the beach. He was not alone. The pale gray coat was coming down the path from the ridge at an unhurried walk, and would be at the beach in perhaps 4 minutes. The man on the far bank with the hookless line had stood up and was wading across the shallows. Bryn counted. 3 men close, 1 man 4 minutes out, and the only weapon in the boat was Carrie's small kitchen knife, which Bryn had tucked into her belt and which would, in a fight against 3 armed men, last her perhaps 8 seconds. She did not reach for the knife. She put her hand on the silver at her throat instead. She had not put her hand to the silver at her throat in 26 years. She put it there now. The mark went warm, not the banked coal warm of an hour ago on the platform. A deeper warm, a warm that was, she realized with a quiet that surprised her, not coming from her throat. It was coming from her hand. Her hand was warm because something was answering her hand. Something the lock had been keeping in. Something that had been waiting 26 years. The man in the brown cloak stepped into the shallows and reached for the bow of the boat with a leather-gloved hand. He was a careful man, and he was not afraid, because he had been told what he was collecting, and he had been told the collection would be docile after the morning the woman had had. He was a moment from being wrong about that. Bryn did not raise her hand from her throat. She turned her palm outward, the small natural gesture of a person offering something they did not know they had to offer. And what came out of her hand was not flame, and was not lightning, and was not any of the things the village stories about the silver-throated girl had warned about for 26 years. What came out of her hand was light. The light was the exact pale silver of the scar at her throat, and it was the exact pale silver of the older coin in her pouch, and it was the exact pale silver of the twinned arc on Kaylin's chest. And it did not strike the man in the brown cloak. It went past him. It went past him and over the surface of the river, and up the gravel, and over the second man waiting, and over the third man on the path, and it kept going, and at the place where it passed each man, the man fell forward as though a string had been cut. Not dead, not bleeding, the simple folding fall of a body whose second self had been temporarily, gently, set down on the floor of its own house and asked to wait. The man in the brown cloak fell into the shallows on his hands and knees and stayed there, looking at his own palms in the water as though he had never seen them before. The second man sat down in the shallows with great care and began, slowly, to laugh, which Bryn understood without being told was the sound a person made when the bond inside them was the wrong shape and had just been straightened. The third man on the path lay down on the gravel and did not move. The light did not reach Aldrich Vey, 4 minutes up the path, because Bryn had not aimed it that far, because she had not aimed it at all. She had only opened her hand. She closed her hand. The light went. She sagged forward over Kaylin with the kind of sudden, bone-deep exhaustion a person feels after carrying water uphill for an hour and stopping all at once. And Kaylin, with the arrowhead still in his back and the iron wounds in his shoulders barely sealed, found her wrist with his hand and held it. He did not say anything about what she had just done. He did not have to. The bond was doing the talking again, and the bond was, for the first time since the platform, openly afraid. Not of her, for her. Bryn lifted her head. Up the path, the pale gray coat had stopped walking. Aldrich Vey, who had watched the silver light come down the river and reach within 20 paces of his boots and stop, was standing very still on the path, and Bryn could see, even at that distance, that he was smiling. He was smiling because what he had just seen was not a weapon. What he had just seen was the lock opening from the inside. What he had just seen was the answer to 26 years of patience. He raised a hand. He did not raise it at Bryn. He raised it at the ridge above the path, and on the ridge above the path 2 further men appeared who who had been waiting on the ridge for exactly this signal, and they began, at a steady run, to come down. Bryn looked at Kaelin. Kaelin looked at her. The boat was on the gravel. The pole was gone. The two men in the water were not getting up, but were not going anywhere either. The path to the stones was open for as long as it took those two men on the ridge to come down, which was perhaps 3 minutes. The stones were perhaps 2 minutes' walk up the path. The math was thin. The math was thin, but the math was math. Bryn slid out of under Kaelin's head and stood up in the boat and stepped down into the cold shallow of the river, and the cold of the river on her ankle steadied her in a way she needed steadying. She turned and got her arm under Kaelin's good shoulder. He stood. The leg held. The leg held because the second self in him was holding it for him by main force, and Bryn could feel through the bond that this holding would cost him something later, and that he did not care about later. They went up the gravel beach together. The man in the brown cloak watched them go, with the calm, wondering face of a man who had been turned, for an hour, into a person who would no longer be useful to Aldrich Vey. They reached the foot of the path. The path was old. The path had been worn into the moss by feet older than Lomere, older than the Iron Court, older than the language the auctioneer had used to void the sale. Bryn felt the silver at her throat go warm a third time, the last time it would go warm in this story. And this time, the warmth was not a banked coal at all. This time, the warmth was a small returning thing under her skin saying, almost shyly, that she was being welcomed home by a place she had never been. The ruins sat in a wide, flat circle of moss at the top of the path, ringed by 7 standing stones taller than a man, and 1 stone in the center that had fallen long ago and lay on its side like a low table grown through with time. The light at the top of the path was different from the light on the river. The light at the top of the path was the soft level light a clearing keeps when the trees around it have agreed over centuries not to lean. Bryn brought Kaelin into the circle. He had stopped speaking again, conserving. She brought him to the fallen stone and helped him sit on it, and the moment his weight settled on the stone, the arrowhead in his back gave a small, audible click, the small sound a thing makes when it has been told, by a power older than the iron it was forged from, that it is no longer required. And the arrowhead came out of him, through the cloth of his shirt, and landed on the moss with a sound like a dropped coin. The wound closed, not slowly, cleanly. The iron wounds in his shoulders did the same in the next breath. The broken bone in his leg did not heal. Bone took longer, even here. But the pain in his face eased, and Bryn felt through the bond the easing of it as a sudden, cool draft on the inside of her own ribs. He looked up at her. The 2 men from the ridge were coming up the path. They would be at the foot of the path in perhaps a minute and a half. Aldrich Vey would be behind them. There would not be time, at the foot of the path, for the men to come into the circle, because the circle did not let in men who had been sent to take. But there would also not be time, in the circle, for Bryn and Kaelin to do what they needed to do, in any way that was not the simplest version of itself. They both understood this without saying it. Kaelin took Bryn's hands. His were rough and dry and warm. Hers were cold from the river and shaking, and she let them shake, because she had spent 26 years not letting her hands shake in front of people and was finished with that. He said her name. She said his. He said, "You know what this is." She said, "Yes." He said, "Do you want it?" She had spent her life having things done to her or refused her, and she had spent her life not being asked. She looked at him on the fallen stone in the borrowed cloak, with the dirt of 3 days on him and the gold of his eyes steady on her face, and she understood that the question was the thing. The question, not the answer. The question was the part that had been taken from her at 4 years old, when a king she had never met had been marked into her throat without her opinion. The question, returned to her now on the top of a path, with two men coming up it, was the thing the lock had been built to prevent. She said, "Yes." She said it the way a person says a word they have been carrying for a very long time without knowing they were carrying it. He nodded. He did not move yet. He waited the small, further beat that a person waits when they want to make sure the yes is the yes the speaker meant. She nodded back. Then he stood. The leg held again, by the circle now, and not by the second self. And he put his hands on either side of her face, and he set his forehead against hers. And Bryn put her hands on his wrists, and the standing stones around them did the thing standing stones in old stories do, which was not a flare of light or a chime or any of the showy things the village songs had told her to expect. The stones simply, very quietly, brightened by half a degree, the way a room brightens when a curtain has been drawn back behind the watcher without their noticing. The mark on his chest under the borrowed shirt warmed once. The silver at her throat warmed once. The two warmings met somewhere between them, in the small space of breath between his mouth and hers, and stayed. He bent. He did not bite this time. The biting had been done in front of the court. The court had been the place for teeth. The circle was the place for the other thing. He kissed her. She had been kissed exactly once in her life, badly, at 16, by a boy on a dare who had then washed his mouth out at the well in front of his friends. She had carried that as the only data point for kissing for 10 years. This kiss replaced it. This kiss was the slow, careful kiss of a man who had 3 minutes and intended to use one of them and not a second more, who knew that what was happening between them in this circle was being witnessed by a power older than the Iron Court, and that the witness was the marriage, not the gesture, and who wanted all the same for Bryn Aldane to know in her body what being chosen with her own consent felt like, because she had not, in 26 years, been given the chance to know. She knew. The bond closed. Not the bond that had been written into her throat at 4 years old. That bond had been a lock, and the lock had been broken. And what was closing now in its place was the other thing, the thing the lock had been built to prevent, the bond two people made when they were both standing up and both saying yes. It closed with a small, soft, internal click she felt in her chest, the way a door feels when it has been pulled to from the inside by a hand that meant to. The standing stones dimmed by half a degree. The circle exhaled. At the foot of the path, the two men from the ridge stopped walking. They stopped not because anyone had told them to stop, but because the path, very politely, had stopped being a path that would take them any further. Aldrich Vey, behind them, understood before they did, and the smile on Aldrich Vey's face went, for the first time in 26 years, off. Bryn lifted her head from Kaylin's. Her hands were still on his wrists. His were still on her face. The circle around them was, for the moment, the only place in the world they were welcome, and the only place they were safe. And both of those would be true only for as long as they stayed inside it. She knew this. He knew this. Aldrich Vey, 20 paces down a path that no longer wished to be a path, knew it too. Which was why Aldrich Vey did not turn and leave. Aldrich Vey sat down on a stump at the foot of the path with the patient air of a man who had been patient for 26 years and saw no reason to lose the habit now. And he folded his pale gray gloves in his lap, and he settled in to wait them out. He could wait them out. Bryn understood, with a small, clean, dropping feeling in her stomach, that the circle did not feed people. The circle did not water people. The circle did not heal a broken leg faster than bone wished to be healed. The circle was a marriage hall. It was not a fortress. Sooner or later, in a day or 2 days, one of them would walk out of it for the other one's sake, and Aldrich Vey would be there at the foot of the path with his pale gray gloves still folded in his lap. She told Kalen this without speaking. The bond carried it. Kalen, his thumb on the silver at her throat now in the small, soft way of a man learning, by touch, the shape of the thing the world had been lying about for 26 years, told her back, also without speaking, that this was true, and that it was also not the only true thing. He said aloud, because some things had to be said aloud the first time, that the bond they had just closed had not only locked, it had also opened. He said it had opened a door he had not known existed, and that the door led, in a direction he could feel along the inside of his own ribs, toward the place where what remained of his pack was waiting. He said the bond had made him findable to them, and them findable to him, in a way the old written bond could never have done, because the old written bond had been a lock, and locks did not call across distance. He said the pack would be moving already. He said 3 days north was a long walk on a broken leg, but it was a short ride for a pack that knew exactly where to ride to, and that had, in the last hour, been told. Bryn took this in. She had not, in any version of her life she had imagined for herself, been a person whom a pack rode for. She found to her surprise that the idea did not frighten her. She found that the silver at her throat, which had been a debt and a stigma and a closed door for 26 years, was warm in a way that was no longer about Kalen specifically, but about the larger thing the bond had opened her into, the network of people Kalen belonged to, and who now, by the simple fact of her standing in this circle, with her forehead against his, belonged also, in some careful and not yet defined way, to her. She thought of Meg, she thought of Carrie, she thought of the older coin in the pouch she had left on the platform rail, and of the woman who had walked into Lomere out of a snowstorm in the year her mother was born, and had refused to say where she had walked out of. She thought she might, one day soon, find out where the woman had walked out of. She thought she might find out a great deal of things. Kalen, watching her face, said, "You are thinking." She said, "Yes." He said, "What about?" She said, "My grandmother." He nodded. He did not press. He had a pack coming. He had a wife in a circle of stones. He had time, now, that he had not had at dawn, and time was the rarest thing the morning had given them, and he intended to spend it carefully. He sat back down on the fallen stone and patted the moss beside him, and Bryn sat. He put his arm around her shoulders, the small, careful gesture of a man who had not, in his adult life, been permitted to sit on a stone with a woman under his arm and was not going to waste the permission. She leaned into him. The borrowed cloak smelled of Meg's brother and of riverweed and of the iron the wounds had left behind, and under all of that, faintly, of him, the scent she had not had words for an hour ago, and had words for now, because the bond had given her the words the way a bond gives a person the small private vocabulary of the person they have closed with. They sat. At the foot of the path, Aldrich Vey adjusted the angle of his pale gray gloves on his knee. Bryn watched him without watching him. He was a problem. He was the next problem. He was not, she understood with a quiet that had not been in her for 26 years, a problem she was going to solve alone. The light in the clearing began to change. Not toward dusk yet, the sun was barely past noon, but toward the soft level shift a place makes when a place is preparing, in its slow way, to receive guests. Kalen lifted his head from where it had been resting against Bryn's. He listened. Bryn listened. She did not hear what he heard for another half-minute, and then she heard it. Hooves. Many hooves. Not on the path, because the path had withdrawn its hospitality, but in the woods on the high side of the ridge, the long sweep of forest that ran north and west from the temple ruins, and that connected, if a rider knew the trails, to the country 3 days north, where Kalen had said the pack was waiting. The hooves were coming, the bond told her, very fast. They were coming faster than 3 days. They were coming the way a thing comes when it has been called, and is answered, and has not stopped to ask whether the road was passable, because the call had made the road passable. Aldrich Vey heard the hooves too. Aldrich Vey stood up off his stump and unfolded his pale gray gloves and put them on, the small, considered gesture of a man recalculating the morning. The two men who had come down off the ridge looked at Aldrich Vey. Aldrich Vey looked up the path. He could not see into the circle because the circle would not let him see. But he could hear the hooves on the wind, and he could read the wind, and he understood, with the precision of a man who had spent 26 years arranging the weather to his liking, that the wind had turned. He did not run. Men like Aldrich Vey did not run from a single shift in weather. He said something quiet to the two men with him. The two men with him melted back up the ridge and were gone. Aldrich Vey himself, alone now at the foot of the path, took out a small, folded square of paper from the inside of his pale gray coat and looked at it for a long moment, and then he refolded it and put it back and turned, with great composure, and walked away down the river path in the direction of Lowmere. He did not look back. Bryn watched him go. She did not feel triumph, because triumph would have been the wrong size for the feeling. She felt, instead, the small, flat understanding that he would be back. He would be back tomorrow, or the day after, or in a month, and he would be back with a different plan, and the plan would be cleverer than the plan that had just walked away from a clearing it could not enter. Because Aldrich Vey was a clever man, and clever men did not lose to a single bad morning. He would be a problem for a long time. She accepted this. She had been a problem for the village of Lowmere for 26 years. She could be patient with a man who intended to be a problem for her in return. The hooves came closer. They came over the ridge and down the long western slope at a pace Bryn would not, in her village life, have believed a horse could keep. And there were more of them than she had thought from the first listen. Perhaps 12 riders, perhaps 15. And at the head of them rode a woman, Kaelin. Beside her on the fallen stone, sat up straighter to see. He said a name. The name was Marin. He said it the way a person says the name of a sister who had been a long time gone. Marin came down off the ridge and into the clearing at the foot of the path, where the path, recognizing her by way of recognizing the man on the stone, opened politely and let her in. She rode a tall gray mare with a notched ear. She had Kaelin's gold eyes and a long pale scar across her chin. She brought the mare to a stop at the foot of the path, and she swung down, and she walked the path on foot, because it would have been presumption to ride into the circle, and at the edge of the circle she stopped. She did not enter. She bowed her head, very deliberately, to Kaelin. Then she bowed her head, with the same deliberation, to Bryn. Bryn felt the second bow and the silver at her throat. Kaelin stood up off the fallen stone. The leg held. Bone or no bone, the circle's gift or the bond's, she did not know. And he walked the 3 paces to the edge of the circle, and he put his hand on Marin's shoulder, and Marin put her hand on his, and they stood like that for a long moment without speaking, the way people stand when there is too much to say, and the saying can wait until later. Then Marin lifted her head, and she looked past Kaelin at Bryn, and she said in a voice that was rough with riding and with something else, that she had felt the bond close an hour ago over the back of her mare while she had been galloping along the high ridge road, and that she had nearly come off the mare from the shock of it, and that she had not, in her life, expected to feel that particular bond close, because she had been 4 years old when she had watched her brother be told the girl he was marked to had died of fever in a border village, and she had grown up with the believing of it. She said, "You are not dead." Bryn in the circle said, "No." Marin laughed. It was a short, rough laugh, and Bryn liked it immediately. Marin said, "Then come out of the circle, sister, because the rest of us cannot come in. And we have brought a horse for you. And there is a place 3 days north where a great many people would very much like to meet the woman who has just done what you have just done. Bryn looked at Kaelin. Kaelin held out his hand. She took it. They walked out of the circle together. The circle let them go the way a hall lets out a wedding party, without ceremony, with the small, invisible blessing that hung in the air behind them as they went. There were 15 riders, Bryn counted, because she was a person who counted in unfamiliar rooms, and would always be. They had brought 2 spare horses, a long-legged bay for Kaelin and a smaller dun mare for Bryn, and they had brought a folded cloak for Bryn that was the deep green of thorn pack colors, and that Maren put around her shoulders herself at the edge of the path. The small, formal gesture of a woman pack second welcoming a woman pack first into a place at her own shoulder. They had also brought, Bryn noticed, a healer, an older man with calm hands who came forward without being asked, and looked at Kaelin's leg and made a small, considering sound, and produced from a saddlebag a splint better than Meg's, and a tincture that smelled like ash and rosemary, and changed the smell of the air around Kaelin by half within a minute of being applied. They did not, Bryn noticed also, ask her any questions. They did not ask her where she was from. They did not ask her how old she was. They did not ask her about the silver at her throat or about the light that had come out of her hand by the river, although Maren had clearly been told about both by one of the scouts they had sent ahead. They did not ask because the bond had answered all of those questions for them already, in the hour they had been riding, and what remained for them to ask was the kind of question that waited until people had eaten and slept and washed the iron blood off them. They were, Bryn realized with a small, steadying gladness, pack. She had heard the word her whole life and had understood, in a flat, external way, what it meant. She had not understood until this hour what it meant from the inside. From the inside, it meant that 15 people had ridden a road that had not existed an hour earlier, and had brought a green cloak in the right size. Kaelin mounted with help. He did not like being helped, Bryn could feel through the bond, but he accepted it from the older healer, in the way a man accepts a thing from a man who had bandaged his father, which Bryn understood by the bond was what this older man had done. Bryn mounted the dun mare. She had ridden, in her life, exactly 3 times, a pony at 6, a borrowed donkey at 12, and a draft horse bareback at 21, when the village had needed someone to fetch the midwife, and had not, in the moment, cared who. The dun mare was kinder than any of those. The mare turned her head and breathed against Bryn's knee in the polite way a horse greets a new rider it has been told to be patient with. And Bryn put her hand on the mare's neck, and the mare accepted the hand, and Maren, watching, said only, "Good," and turned her own gray, and the column began to move. They did not go north. They went up the river first, away from Low Mere, until the river bent west, and then they went west along the bend for a 1/4 mile, and then they cut up a deer track Bryn had not known existed and that led, by switchbacks, up the back of the ridge that the temple ruins sat on the front of. Maren rode at the head. The healer rode beside Kaelin. Bryn rode beside Maren by Maren's clear and unspoken decision, which Bryn understood was both honor and a deliberate placement, because Maren wanted, in the next 3 days of riding, to know who her brother had walked out of a circle of stones with. Bryn was content to be known. She had spent 26 years not being known, and had no objection to being known by a woman with Kaelin's eyes and a notched-eared mare and a laugh like that. Halfway up the ridge, where the trail flattened for a stretch of perhaps 50 paces, Maren slowed her gray to a walk, and Bryn slowed the dun beside her, and Maren, looking ahead between the mare's ears, said quietly that the regent had been a problem for the pack for 6 years, and would be a problem for the pack for some time yet, and that Bryn should not, in the next 3 days, expect the problem to be a thing the pack could solve quickly. Bryn said she had expected that. Marin glanced sideways at her. She said, "You have." Bryn said yes. Marin nodded once, the satisfied small nod of a woman taking a measurement and finding the measurement matched the expectation she had brought to it, and she did not press further. Behind them, Kalen rode with his bad legs straight in the stirrup and his hand on the bay's neck, and Bryn could feel through the bond that he was watching her ride with Marin and was, for the first time in 3 days, pleased about something. The bond carried his pleasure into her ribs as a small warm pressure she did not know what to do with, because nobody, in 26 years, had been quietly pleased by the sight of her doing anything, and she had not built any habits for being on the receiving end of that. She would have to build the habits. She had time. They rode. The sun went past noon and slid down the back half of the sky. The trail topped the ridge and went down the other side into a long, shallow valley Bryn had never seen, although it sat perhaps 4 hours' ride from the village she had grown up in, and in the valley, a stream ran south and crossed under a low wooden bridge, and at the bridge, 2 further riders waited who had not been with the original 15, and they fell into the column at the rear without speaking, the small, precise addition of a pack closing its ranks around a returning king. Bryn looked back once, somewhere on the descent into the valley, in the direction of Lomere. She could not see it from where she was. The ridge was in the way. She did not need to see it. She was finished with seeing it. They made camp at the bridge as the light went, because Kalen's leg would not hold a full day's ride, and because Marin was a careful commander, and because, more quietly, the pack wanted a night with their king back among them before they pressed on. 2 of the riders went out for wood, 2 more went out for water. The healer set Kalen down on a folded blanket by the stream and began the long, careful work of resetting the broken leg properly, with Bryn sitting at Kalen's head and holding his hand through it, and the bond between them taking some of the pain of the resetting into itself and dispersing it the way a wet cloth disperses heat. Kalen did not cry out. Bryn felt him not cry out, which was a different thing from not feeling him in pain, and she held his hand and she did not look away. When the healer was done, he wrapped the leg in a fresh splint and laid a clean cloth soaked in something cool over the knee, and he stood up and bowed, not deeply, the small working bow of a man who had finished a job he was being paid in loyalty for, and he went away to eat. The fire was built. The food was modest. Bread, hard cheese, a stew of root vegetables a younger rider had been carrying in a covered iron pot and had reheated over the fire, and Bryn, who had not eaten since before dawn, ate slowly because her stomach had not eaten in a day and needed to be coaxed. Marin sat across the fire from her. Marin ate with the steady, unhurried efficiency of a woman who had eaten a great many meals on the road. The other riders sat in 2s and 3s around the fire, talking quietly, and from time to time one of them glanced at Bryn and looked away again, and Bryn understood that they were not staring exactly. They were taking in the fact of her, the way a household takes in a piece of furniture they had not known had been delivered, until they walked into the room and saw it standing there, and they were, in their quiet pack way, finding the place where she fit. After the food was eaten and the bowls washed in the stream and stacked, Marin stood up and walked the perimeter of the camp, the way a woman who had done it 1,000 times walked it, and the camp settled into the small, soft noises of a pack going to ground for a night, the shifting of horses, the snap of a fire being banked, the low murmur of 2 riders telling a story they had told each other before. The healer came back once to check Kalen's leg and then left them to it. Marin, on her return from the perimeter, came to Bryn and put a folded bedroll into her hands and said quietly that she had taken the watch in 2 shifts, so neither Bryn nor Kalen would need to keep one, and that breakfast would be at dawn and they would ride at first light. Bryn thanked her. Marin said, "Sister," and went to her own bedroll on the far side of the fire. Bryn sat with the folded bedroll in her lap and looked at Kalen, who was lying on his back on the blanket by the stream with his eyes closed and the firelight moving over his face. The dirt of 3 days had been washed off him at some point in the last hour, by the healer or by one of the younger riders, and the borrowed shirt had been replaced with a clean one. He was the cleanest he had been since dawn. The mark on his chest was hidden under the new shirt, but the bond carried it into her ribs, steady as a heartbeat. She got up and laid the bedroll out beside him, and lay down on it, and she pulled the green pack cloak over both of them. He opened his eyes. He looked at her. He did not speak. She put her hand on his chest, over the place where the mark was, and she felt the warmth of it through the cloth, and she felt the warmth of the silver at her throat answer the way 2 banked fires in the same hearth answer each other, although the silver at her throat did not, this time, go warm in the way it had gone warm 3 times that day. It simply was warm now, the way a thing that had been cold for 26 years and was now no longer cold was warm. He turned his head and put his mouth against her forehead. He said, in the rough, low voice she was going to know for the rest of her life, that she had been the bravest person in the market this morning, by a margin that embarrassed everyone else who had been there. She laughed once, a small, startled sound, because nobody in 26 years had said anything to her in the tone in which he had said that. He said, also, that he had spent 3 days in a wagon thinking about how to die without making it easy for them, and that he had stopped thinking about that the moment the mallet had struck the 3rd time, and that he wanted her to know he had stopped thinking about it the moment the mallet had struck, and not the moment she had bid, because he had stopped thinking about it on the 3rd strike of the mallet, when a hand he had not yet seen had set a pouch on the platform rail with the small particular sound a hand makes when the hand has decided. He said he had known her by the sound the pouch made. She did not have anything to say back to this for a while. When she did, she said only that she had spent 26 years not being decided about, and that she was going to spend a long time learning how to be decided about, and that she would also, in that time, learn how to decide things back, and that he should be patient with her while she learned, because she did not yet know how good she would be at it. He said he would be patient. He said he had spent 6 years being patient, and had become, against his will, very good at it. He said he intended to apply the skill, now, to something he wanted to be patient about, rather than to something he had been forced to be patient about. He said, in the same low, rough voice, her name. She said his. The fire on the other side of the camp settled down to coals. The stream ran. Somewhere up the ridge, a nightbird called, and another answered it. Bryn closed her eyes with her hand on Kaylin's chest, and Kaylin closed his with his mouth at her forehead, and the bond between them held them in the small, steady way bonds hold the people they have chosen, and the pack around them slept the careful pack sleep of 15 people who had ridden a road that had not existed at dawn and had brought their king back over it. There was a path back to Lomir somewhere, and there was a man in a pale gray coat at the end of it, and there was an older coin in a pouch on an iron court platform rail that had not been collected yet, and there was a sigil on that coin nobody in this camp had spoken aloud, and there were going to be, before this story was finished, a great many further hard things. None of them were tonight. There was something about the way she had said yes to him in the circle that she found she was not going to be able to shake. The small, undecorated yes of a woman who had been given the question for the first time and had answered it without looking around the room for permission. If you had been Bryn Aldane at the top of that path, with 2 men coming up it and a borrowed cloak on your shoulders, and 26 years of being told you were a debt the gods had defaulted on, standing behind you, would you have said it the same way she did? I'd love to know what you think. See you in the next story.